Okay, the recording has started. Thank you.
It's good. Thank you. Thank you, Ando. And yeah, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night. I'm not sure where everyone is. So I'm sure that Arthur and Ando already provided like quite a nice introduction, lots of technical details, I imagine, to the concept. Unfortunately, I was lecturing, I couldn't attend live, but I know some of the content. And what I'm going to do now in this next 45 minutes, I would say, is to provide a little bit of an idea of a more general context of some of the work that's not the operating envelopes framework somehow sit in. And much of this was developed in the context of Project Edge with HouseNet and IEMO model. It was like a wonderful project where all of us were involved, covering different areas. So it was covering the different aspects, but you look at techno-economics of local network services, as well as like impact on the broader system. This is somehow related to the bigger picture discussion that I'm going to have now, and kind of information and maybe different perspective I'm going to provide now. So to give you a little bit of context, and maybe you might have seen some of this before, but it's always good to repeat the general ideas. So we know that moving forward, especially in Australia, we have like massive amounts of distributed energy resources coming to the grid. If you look at, for example, step change scenario, the Integrated System Plan 2022, effectively we see that pretty much 50%, between like rooftop PV and distributed storage, coordinated or not as virtual power plants, would represent a capacity that would be available in the grid. Obviously, we cannot ignore this huge penetration distributed energy resources. Already now, Australia has got the deepest penetration of DR in the world, probably be at least at this level, not higher. Essentially, like keeping growing. And so how do we deal with this? We cannot just ignore this in the context of the system, not only just of operating distribution networks. However, of course, the story of the developments of network constraints and allocation of network capacity to DR comes with the first problem you will see there is at the level at the local network. So with relatively small penetration of DR, the system really doesn't have an issue. DR is somehow a little bit of a negative demand, in case we only have to deal with the local network constraints, thermal voltage limits, and so on that Arthur and Nando would have shown. So effectively, we start with a level of sophistication. You look at what ENA was doing like a couple of years ago, very nicely. We say we can start with kind of relatively small level of sophistication, and we can unlock value that is primarily around what can happen locally. And we can do this, for example, by tariff reform, particularly in the context of try to, for example, incentivize self-consumption or to harm the local network. And then in case start introducing, if things becomes more complicated, some export limits. And of course, the first idea would be to have static export limits, which you say, well, you have like a bunch of DI users, particularly customers with rooftop PV, and I say, well, then you decide that they cannot inject, for example, in the context of export more certain amount. So the classical static export limits, and in this case, passive customers will like passive DR customer in the sense that is not actively participating in the market. Then, of course, things can become more complicated and more complex because, like the penetration of DR becomes deeper and deeper, and then you want to start doing things in a smarter way, not only for local interest but also for the system's interest. Therefore, somehow you move from passive limits, passive export limits, for example, to these ideas of having things more dynamic and network capacity to be allocated in time and in space to the DR active customers through the concept of operating envelope. What are the benefits of doing this? Well, with lots of DR, and let's, for example, in this toy sketch of how a market will work, let's imagine there is no DR in the grid, and then you have like vertical demand, and I say let's keep thinking of DR as a kind of passive relatively passive from a market perspective, effectively being seen as negative demand. With more and more DR exports, you could eventually facilitate kind of a shift of demand towards the left, because again, it would be more that there's negative demand. And of course, as a consequence, you have like prices that become lower and lower, which is what we want to have in the low carbon grids. So somehow, if we manage by this concept of dynamic operating envelopes to unlock network capacity to enable more exports of, for example, PV power to the grid, then somehow prices will benefit. Of course, things, however, are very, very simple and simplified. And it's not only that you increase the output and prices go down, because DR adds to operational complexity at this stage in the context of the whole grid. In particular, if we think that we run a grid basically with visible generators in the transmission grid and invisible DR in distribution network, there's no non-dispatchable and non-controllable, we start having lots of inefficiency, economic inefficiencies in system market operation, lots of potential security issues that might emerge. Now, we've seen this, for example, already several years ago. We start seeing like negative prices with a clear shape of solar profiles in basically all the regions of the NEM, because there is in fact a competition between invisible DR that effectively operates as negative demand is dispatched with priority to grid, and large-scale renewables. And then when the sun shines, it shines for everyone, and somehow you are like DR that keeps injecting large-scale renewables that, subject to negative prices, will be will perform commercial curtailment. So somehow there are already inefficiencies that we start seeing in the grid. How can we improve from an economic perspective, from a market perspective, this interaction between distributed resources and large-scale resources? Of course, then with more and more DR, we start seeing security issues, and like, of course, the minimum demand problems. Now, how can you stabilize the grid when there is lots of DR? Can we still provide, for example, frequency control, short circuit current, reactive power control when there is lots of DR during the day? You know, before, the minimum demand problem was during the night. We have, like, for example, synchronous generators running during the night to absorb reactive power. The voltages in transmission are going too high to provide frequency control services, providing system strength, short circuit current. Now, during the day, with lots of this distributed generation in the grid, fewer synchronous generators, the system becomes weaker, and on top of that, we'll not be able to have all the ancillary services that we would need to run the grid in a secure way. To the point that eventually you may end up in this kind of situations. I love this headline from ABC News. You know, of course, the PV, rooftop PV was not switched off like this, but we know that this has already happened, and AIMO is starting procuring this kind of emergency services systematically, because there is a true risk of demand disconnection. But perhaps things could be done in a better way. We do not need to keep running a fragile grid, more fragile grid with all renewables, with all this DR being invisible, not dispatchable, not controllable. Maybe we can use the operating envelopes also for security functionalities, and then the interaction of the DSOs with the potential retailers and aggregators, and of course, fundamentally, the DR customers, also to provide system services, including potentially security services. So, for example, this kind of DR disconnection in the future could happen by manipulating the operating envelopes, and potentially, DR might be compensated because of providing kind of emergency service. I mean, this, of course, it's all so to be discussed in the context of regulatory developments, but these are all potential opportunities. Same as fundamentally the huge opportunities that are arising for DR in the context of saying more and more large-scale renewables, of course, and traditional providers of system flexibility, security services somehow disappearing, more and more distributed resources. At the moment, what we're doing is like we somehow use pumped hydro and large-scale batteries to help the grid with its security, but with all, again, the DR coming to the grid, can we think of a system where it's DR for virtual power plants, communities, microgrids, so aggregation of DR in different forms, and then interaction potential with other energy sectors. So sector coupling, for heating, for transport, maybe future fuels, maybe some hydrogen in the game there. So all this DR now starting providing flexibility and security services. So again, now DR really starts competing with the large-scale generators, not only to sell energy, but also to sell potentially security, flexibility, and reliability services. In fact, it's a fundamental change, fundamental shift in terms of direction of flexibility from a few hundreds of generators that would supply flexibility to an inflexible demand side in which a network were relatively passive distribution network operator to do very little besides maintenance and planning for network enforcement, to a grid of tomorrow that to some extent is already a grid of today, where eventually we see more and more large-scale renewables coming to the grid. These large-scale renewables, because of their variability and partial unpredictability, require more flexibility services, more reserve services, and therefore there is an opportunity for distributed energy resources to provide this flexibility service, to provide system balancing. Once you have all this distributed storage, I showed before, basically maybe like 25%, 30% of the future capacity in the NEM might be, probably would be distributed storage. You have like massive amount of mobile storage in electric vehicles. So how we must deliver, on this capability and providing some system balancing also with that. We cannot ignore DR. First of all, we can't do this massive system control at distribution level with all these active resources with very rudimental tools. So we need to become more elaborate in terms of the technical tools, but also the commercial, the regulatory tools that we would adopt moving forward. And it's in this context that we really want to have complete value release when DR penetration becomes really significant. And while the system becomes more decarbonized and potentially becoming weaker and requiring more security services, then we need to think more of how we build some kind of platforms, like technical platforms and commercial platforms, look more at optimization of services from DR, and again, both in terms of energy, but also in terms of ancillary services and potentially network services. So in this context, somehow we can think of DR really becoming an active player, where at scale now we will see virtual power plants, energy communities, microgrids, whatever aggregation forms we may come up with, trying to interact with the rest of the grid, competing with large-scale generation, large-scale renewables and storage, at the same time also somehow exchanging locally power, like, for example, peer-to-peer trading schemes and so on. So with all this complexity, with all this active demand managed directly by aggregators, communities, community managers, or automated platforms, as for example, in the case of potential peer-to-peer trading, somehow to provide all these flexibility services and general trading of energy and different types of services, you end up with breaching constraints very, very likely and very often. So how do you optimize all this? You cannot be too crude in the way of doing this, because the value that you might lose now is huge. At the same time, the value you might unlock is huge. That's why somehow with more and more network issues, because more and more interactions to provide system level services, but again, also potentially local services, you want to have a more active and controllable distribution systems where effectively all these tiny bits are corresponding to kind of the development of dynamic operating envelopes that in space and time can allocate distribution network capacity where most relevant, for example, to provide benefits, to save money to specific customers, to a community, to the system. These are all things that can be done in a different way, as we will see. Eventually, you operate with dynamic operating envelopes at the level of the NIMI or specifically some resources, depending on what will happen next, especially with electric vehicles. But eventually, you would aggregate for example, at the medium voltage, low voltage transformers, the equivalent mapping of what flexibility capability can DR could provide to the rest of the grid, and then upstream starting interacting more with the transmission grid. So effectively, we really start looking into an aggregate of the whole distribution network to be seen as an equivalent participant to provide energy and ancillary services. So effectively, that's where the relationship between aggregators, retailers, but also general concepts like energy communities, microgrids, and so on becomes tighter and tighter, more linked somehow to distribution system operator. Now, imagine a situation where you now have all these resources with the operational capabilities, and eventually these resources are a commercial virtual power plants, whether they are organized as a community, as a microgrid, whatever, or it can be just more distributed, like kind of classical virtual power plant scheme. Eventually, it is a commercial virtual power plant with some capability. At the moment, we primarily see all in terms of active power capability. How much power can we sell? Potential, how much power can we buy? Moving forward, looking, for example, electric vehicles and distributed storage. But in general, these resources, the mostly invertebrate resources, got huge capability also to manipulate and control reactive power. And therefore, eventually you can map the aggregate of what distributed energy resources could do altogether, for example, at the level of the medium voltage, low voltage transformer. It's kind of mapping, PQ mapping, where effectively you have some limits that would be provided by distribution system operator. So like the commercial virtual power plant, only the commercial environment would see the whole potential active and reactive power capability of selling resources. Then that's where the DSO job is. Say, sorry, can't inject or absorb so much power because otherwise I would have thermal voltage limits. So your actual feasible operating region is only the one here. All the rest of the regions are not allowed because otherwise you would breach some safety limits. So this idea is actually what we call the nodal operating envelope. So the dynamic operating envelopes happen at the NIMI level, resource level, and then when you aggregate, you have this nodal operating envelope that somehow is summarizing dynamically the hosting capacity of the whole network, potentially interacting with upstream, with the upstream part of the network and the whole system and market. So somehow this is like a scalable hierarchical concept that can facilitate both commercial functionalities, but also in practice security functionalities, because it provides some form of flexibility and visibility more at the kind of system level. It's interesting also to think at DSO when doing this, somehow also as an aggregator. However, it's a technical aggregator, and that's why somehow you can recognize a DSO as a technical virtual power plant, because effectively it is still aggregating somehow the DR capabilities, but then it's providing this kind of safety lines, and this kind of safety regions that I was showing there, saying, you aggregate, but you can't. You can go somehow beyond this region. So it's like a technical aggregation functionality. So when you do this and when you look at DSO with this technical aggregation functionalities and more generally as a technical actor, then you can start thinking, given again that in most cases not only active power but is reactive power. Reactive power may be valuable in the grid. How value could be unlocked by modulating reactive power and by playing with local services that are based on both reactive power control and basically capacity control, for example, to provide some form of capacity services by playing with both active and reactive power. And just to give you an example from paper we wrote in the middle of the project with Michael, Nando, and everyone. So when we look at the aggregate of a certain network capability, effectively you can think that all the region in purple there would be the potential hosting capacity of the grid in terms of active reactive power. And I say, if I'm operating the grid at this point, because the red regions are not allowed, because DSO tells me that if I do that, I will have a voltage or thermal limit. effectively all the power that I could potentially inject, if there was a need for that, it would be limited to this. So I could move from this point to this point. So this would be the kind of the export that I would be able. For example, imagine that you're operating in a certain condition with certain prices, but then suddenly you got all your batteries full, or your electric vehicles full, for vehicle to grid purposes. Suddenly there are very, very high prices in the grid, and you say, well, I can bid, and I think I can actually make money by selling power. So you would like to sell as much power as possible and change your operating point from this like red X here to somewhere here. But then you would have to stop here, otherwise locally you would breach network constraints. So okay, but what if I could actually change the operational level of the whole distribution grid in terms of reactive power? So I could move in terms of, so I don't change the active power here. I only change the reactive power, for example, by doing reactive power injection, absorption, depending on the conditions. Because would probably be absorption, trying to reduce the voltages to sell more power to the grid, and say you change the operational point to reactive power point, and then look, you are able to actually sell more active power to system. So you unlock active power capacity. So you unlock network capacity that is tangible because it's active power you can sell to the grid by modulating reactive power that can be relatively cheap. So when you start looking at this, you say, well, I'm now in a situation where I start having different DRs, different communities, different virtual power plants that want to sell energy. Potentially they compete with each other to sell energy. So there may be, for example, two commercial virtual power plants. Then there is a DSO that somehow needs to clear up these feasibility regions, but can also, by technical virtual power plant functionalities, then say, well, you have different commercial virtual power plants. Who can give me also some reactive power capability? Of the DSO directly could say, can I change the reactive power profiles or voltage profiles by, for example, using on-load tap changes that I might have, or other reactive power resources might have. So by doing this, either by contracting DR services for reactive power, or by using its own network service, for example, on-load tap changes, then I could start looking into the possibility of having different kind of bids functions, actually different levels of power being sold at different prices, but also as a function of the reactive power capability, reactive power control that is embedded in the network, available in the network, or potentially procured by contracts with DR aggregators. So when you do that, effectively now see really the whole distribution grid, or part of the distribution grid, that is playing with the commercial virtual power plants to sell power, with the technical virtual power plants, the DSO, to facilitate locally this exchange while staying within network limits, but potentially also managing the dispatch of local network services for reactive power, for capacity, to be able eventually to sell more power to the grid, and of course not making more money. Because I say able to sell, also the opposite is true, or can buy, depending on direction, the price that you could access, and so on. Of course, now you can start thinking there is more than that. Say you really want to do like a real virtual power plant. So okay, then you start doing like conventional generators do, combined cycle gas turbine also sells, for example, flexibility services and frequency control ancillary services, also reactive power support. And they say when you aggregate this and say I am operating here, and my feasibility area is all within the black region there. Well, can you change the operating point up and down, upward, downward in 6 seconds, 60 seconds, 5 minutes, 1 second, to provide, for example, by changing point, a raise or lower 6 seconds, 60 seconds, 5 minutes frequency control ancillary service. So effectively now your aggregate can really be basically visualized as a real power plant. Eventually, if you are familiar with the PQ capability of synchronous generators, it looks exactly like this. As I said, it's not only in terms of active power, it's also in terms of reactive power, the potential you could trade with the rest of the grid, and locally you could use to actually unlock capacity to help managing locally the voltages and then enable more active power capacity to be sold to the system. That was the idea somehow that drove all our work in terms of developing local exchange services within Project Edge. So basically to say, how can we optimize local system operation with all this DR subject to constraints, but also unlocking all the potential opportunities at the system level through active power sale, of course, but also reactive power interaction locally and globally. So there is a little bit of a framework that we had to develop, saying, okay, identify where can be the requirements, the benefits in times and location. How can we help, especially in terms of unlocking capacity or modulating reactive power and voltages? Say there may be network solution or DSO may have available by a load tap changes or other resources. Then say, in order you could contract some of these services with distributed resources and aggregators, and I will show you some example. And then eventually you say, okay, what makes sense economically? Do I only use my actual resources, for example, load tap changes? Do I start procuring DR services for capacity and reactive power? Then what is the value of this contract? How do I value this? Or do I build something? For example, do I reinforce a transformer? Do I introduce reactive power, more reactive power compensation, more on load tap change capabilities because I can unlock more active power capacity? So there was like a fundamental problem we're dealing with in Edge, on the side with HouseNet, trying to design this local services exchange interaction with the rest of the grid, and eventually try to understand how like investment could be investment of services could be procured in an intelligent way. Of course, then it will require some regulatory changes, but this would be like a next step. The moment you can demonstrate that there is value, then what would be needed to actually unlock this value commercially and of course from a regulatory perspective. So how do we do this? Such a framework does not exist. So first of all, say, okay, what is really driving the value is of course trying to unlock capacity, basically trying to relieve, thermal and voltage constraints. So, okay, what are then the fundamental principle of doing this? There will be value if there is a network constraint. Like if a network is unconstrained, then there is no reason to kind of trade services because those commodities have got zero value. Then effectively the value is temporal because the grid changes all the time. A peak, off-peak, minimum load, maximum load will be completely different situation, completely different requirements for at the system level, but also locally. The value is locational. You may be like behind the constraint. You can help relieving a constraint. If you are in an area where there is no constraint, particularly because of the topological nature of distribution network, primarily radio, you may not be able to influence network constraints unless you are radially behind a constraint, so downstream constraint. And then, of course, it's like you do not have to think of your active power. Even if you want to sell active power, the value can also be in reactive power because active power value can be unlocked through reactive power, this kind of PQ modulation that I already showed before. So we developed a methodology. We needed to develop a methodology that could somehow capture the physical aspects. Nando would have showed, talking about multi-phase unbalanced power flows, optimal power flows potentially, locational aspects. Network is different everywhere, and of course, temporal aspects, active and reactive power play together. So it's a bit more complicated potentially than at the transmission level where we can somehow separate better active and reactive power. There is an impact on losses, can be significant or not. And somehow we need to be consistent, not only with the physics, but also with economics and with the kind of market developments that we see, for example, specifically in this country. So starting from the theory of locational marginal pricing that we have in a transmission, particularly to play with active power services, then we basically extended this to distribution level, so introduced like distribution locational marginal pricing theory. I mean, that kind of existed in the literature, but was never really applied to real problems, and then it was never addressed really in terms of saying how can I really value this kind of services that could be provided in terms of reactive power and capacity in the context of the theory. So when you look at this locational pricing, eventually you will be able to assess the value of relieving in thermal and voltage constraints. It will be able to assess the value of active and reactive power of specific resources in certain areas of the network to relieve these constraints at a certain time. And then eventually you are able to assess the value of co-optimizing whole system services, but wholesale energy markets, and local services like energy services, but also also reactive power services and capacity services. So, and by the way, I've seen this, I've said this in a few presentations already before, just not to be misunderstood. We're not proposing that now all the distribution network starts having locational marginal price. I mean, we don't have it in transmission. It would be unthinkable to have it, or I never know, but less likely to have it in distribution networks. But what I'm saying is that the theory can be used to value the services. Now, how do you build an economic principles around that? We don't have anything at the moment. So this theory is what we've done is very robust. When it was like kind of accepted by all our project partners. We have like peer-reviewed publications. So it seems like a good approach. Just to give you some examples. I mean, what does it mean in practice? Now, imagine that you have a grid like this, in which you have aggregators that want to sell power to the grid, because, for example, there is very high spot prices. They think they can somehow benefit from this. However, see here you are basically within already. You try to sell power from here. This whatever operation you are, the system is already at the voltage limit. So what you could do, and this is like just by injecting 0.99 megawatts from bus 2, you're already at the voltage limit. So what you can do, however, is, these are the cash flows, just working on active power envelopes you have this. Now, what you can do is you could actually change your reactive power position, and then you do it by operating envelopes by changing the reactive power aspect of operating envelopes. So you do it in different way. Well, there are different ways, but the principle is if you can change the reactive power position, so effectively like absorbing reactive power. Now, while still being within 1.05 per unit limit, you can now inject no longer just 0.29, but 1.6 megawatts. So with prices like that, being able to inject a little bit more has got now huge benefits, because effectively means that with 1 megawatt of reactive power modulation, you can now make effectively almost $20,000 because of the very high prices there. So 1 megawatt of reactive power is unlocking, basically in this case, 1.3 megawatts of active power with potentially huge value. Let's see like very similar situations here. Imagine, for example, that in this case, a bus 3, you basically cannot sell anything because of all these other aggregators or actors here are already somehow congesting the grid upstream. So you cannot sell anything. But then what if the DSO enters a contract with DR aggregators here that cannot sell any active power because the network is congested, but they can basically sell reactive power. So what happens is that by absorbing, for example, 3 megawatt of reactive power here, you can actually unlock. So you see here there is 0 megawatts of power being sold here and 0.29 megawatt power sold there. Now what you do is like you absorb reactive power, you change the voltage profiles, and you enable the aggregator bus 2 to sell more active power. Now there may be different actors in bus 2 and bus 3, but the moment that the DSO can contract with the actor in bus 2 to enable power to be sold from bus 2, the DSO contracts with the actor in bus 3 to enable power to be sold by the actor in bus 2, then effectively now bus 3 and the actor in bus 3 is unlocking the equivalent of $23,000 per megawatt. Now, this is not money that the actor is unlocking for itself is going to benefit the other actors. But as a system, as a whole network, there are benefits for everyone. So the DSO, if the DSO is capable to procure this kind of services and then enter into a system where there is a proper value reallocation of by interacting between active and reactive power, where you see clearly the value of reactive power, temporal and locational in this case, then somehow we could be, facing a completely new world compared to what we see today. So effectively, you see that somehow you can co-optimize both local and system level services, where local service, including again reactive power and capacity that you unlock potentially through that, but you also introduce basically huge opportunities for DR services, with of course the DSO in between in particular, because now DR services, even you cannot sell active power, you can sell the active power and capacity services to someone else. It's quite a kind of intriguing and exciting proposition, potentially. And so all of this somehow can be mathematically and in practice supported by the modeling, this kind of distribution level location manager pricing we developed in Project Edge. Now, still we have, now stepping back for a second, we still have fundamental problem, even without entering this complexity, but also lots of opportunities. What is the actual modeling we should perform and practical allocation we should perform for capacity to DR in terms of active power? Because one of the questions that we're trying to address during the project is, we talked a lot about economics and technical aspects. How about fairness? Nando Arthur mentioned this. So what is fairness? Where is in the national energy objective? Well, you look at that and say, well, in the NEO, effectively, there is the word fairness is not mentioned. There's only economic efficiency. There are more like emission objectives and so on coming up. But really, fairness is not there. So how do we deal with fairness in the context of social license? What is fairness anyway? It is not defined in NEO. And then who is the fairness for? Is it for DR market players? Is it for all DR, including the DR that don't want to participate in the market, just want to be passive exporters, for example? Is it for everyone in the system? Because the prices for everyone are affected by the presence of DR, as I was showing before in my simple sketch of the market. So what we did was we analyzed in Edge a broad spectrum of objective function. Again, Nando, you were seeing this with Nando. Say, do we maximize service? Do we allocate specifically through weights, capacity to different DR? For example, more reliable DR can be allocated more capacity. Do I allocate capacity proportionally to different DR? Do I allocate capacity in a way that somehow the part that is not allocated is equal to all DR? Then do I allocate it the same level for everyone in terms of kilowatts, whether this kilowatt allocation is even more than, for example, what you could potentially sell to the system of the kind of equality. So there are lots of objective functions that make sense. Lots of objective functions have been discussed in practice. Okay, but let's look at the maths formally. What does it mean? Now you look at that, and just for a very simple sketch, because there's pretty complex. It's like some of these things are intuitive, but when you look at the real maths and then the modeling that you need for real networks, it becomes pretty complicated very quickly. And then you say, okay, imagine I have a system like this, where you have like larger DR closer to the feeder, closer to the head of the feeder, and then a smaller DR or farther. And then I start now looking at different ways that I can allocate capacity to these different DR in this very simple toy example. And say, if I wanted to maximize service, export as much as I can, I would allocate the larger amount of capacity, network capacity to DR1, because it's larger, it's closer feeder. I can come up with a certain allocation with alpha equal to 4 is better than alpha equal to 1. So even if I am at the end of the feeder, because someone is very reliable, for example, to provide demand response services, I can actually decide to allocate more network capacity to that one, and say, if I allocate proportionally to the size, I end up with this much. If I allocate unequally, if I allocate equally in terms of how much is not being allocated to each DR, I end up with something like this. And then there is equity and equality. We'll just say we allocate the same for everyone. And in the equality case, actually, because it's the same for everyone, it can be even higher than what is available for the actual DR to export, and somehow it can never be exploited. So when you look at that, you start looking at the overall performance of the system. You may have many different outcomes. Specifically, DR for DR, DR by DR, the outcomes of how much they export will be very different. It's even more interesting to understand what happens then at the system level and how can we make sense of all of that. Again, we need to look into maths rather than only kind of speculating about this. And the way we did it was effectively say, okay, first of all, let's try to have a reference, and we talk about as a reference the customers with DR that were really interesting, that are actively participating in the market. And then we say, we look at different networks, we look at different DR penetration levels, we look at different participation levels for this DR in the marketplace. And then we say, we assess all these different objective functions and even more that I presented against, and some of them will naturally be fair. The kinds of allocating kind of more senior capacity will naturally be intuitively be fair. And then we say, now we start introducing formal metrics, so we can do the maths around it in terms of technical, economic, and fairness. And then we basically introduce a number of technical metrics, utilization of the network, utilization of renewables, and so on. Social metrics that are associated with fairness, and kind of economic metrics that are associated to the kind of social welfare, kind of classical market optimization, where you try to maximize social welfare. So when you look at particularly social metrics, this is like what it's got to do with fairness. We introduced like these three metrics that are somehow available in the literature. Say quality of service. Everyone can get some capacity, but to be fair, somehow it should be similar to what my neighbor has. Then the more we are assigned collectively, the better, the fairer the system is. Then you go with quality of experience. Say, as long as everyone is impacted similarly, the system is fair, even we are all getting curtailed a lot. It's like, as long as we're on the same boat, doesn't matter. And then the mixed max fairness. So difference between winners and losers should be as small as possible. I don't want to have like tall poppies here. Everyone needs to be somehow similar to each other. So these are like kind of standard metrics that are coming from fairness theory, and also borrowed from different contexts. So now you look at the results, say, okay, but what does it mean in practice? Well, you look at the intricate concepts of fairness. You try to be as fair as possible, and then say, well, what happens with the actual more techno-economic metrics? What happens to network utilization of renewables? What happens to social welfare, like system economics? Well, you look at that, effectively, we're not performing very well. And the principle is very simple. The fairer you try to be, is very likely that the more you will operate locally the system in a suboptimal way. So this idea that you try to unlock as much capacity as possible to sell more power to the grid actually is prevented in the first place by your attempt to be fair. So, and unfortunately, the situation is even worse when the DR penetration increases and when the market participation of DR increases. So the more DR you have in the grid, the more you have constraints, the more you would like to be efficient in relieving these constraints, the less you will be when you look at now techno-economic aspects of the local network and then the system. And then the more you try to participate in the market, which is what you would expect moving forward with more actors and maybe taking part in market operation by virtual power plants and so on, because that is the best possible way, ideally, to optimize the economics of the whole system. So the more you try to do that, the more, again, your attempt to be fair in the way that you allocate capacity can prevent the right outcomes and somehow also becoming somehow, in contrast really with what the new objectives could be. So you try to be fair in a way to a number of customers, particularly the ones with DR, and effectively you end up being unfair to everyone else, including effectively customers without DR. Say, because if DR customers could export as much as possible for the system, ideally lowering system prices, then everyone would benefit from these lower system prices. So this negative correlation is quite interesting. I mean, it was like findings. Many of these things were just unexpected when we run studies, but effectively it's like the idea that you reduce capacity to provide system benefits the moment that you try to be more fair in this context. Therefore, you may end up with some kind of socially unfair outcomes for the larger community, potentially even being in opposition to new principles of efficiency and perhaps emission reduction. Of course, this requires a lot more work. Now, what is clear is that the potential role and scope for retailers and aggregators for value redistribution. So same way as I said before, in terms of DSO operating through contracts with different customers to provide, for example, reactive power services to unlock active capacity for other customers to benefit. The same can be done here. So rather than, I think, getting too fixated in terms of how much should each customer be allocated, what we could do is we could have a more powerful commercial regulatory framework. We're saying that it's the aggregate that matters, and then we need to have a very solid foundation for value redistribution to different customers. Now, this value redistribution can be, again, performed by the kind of the methodology we developed through our kind of DLMP modeling and some other considerations, but seems to be like much more efficient way moving forward for the overall system. Of course, this is like a new word in terms of social contract. This is what probably we need to deal with in the next few years or so. We really want to unlock value for DR. Now, just again to say a last thing, is not that we need necessarily a distributed market to do that. We can still try to do things as efficiently as possible by tariffs, but of course we need to really introduce efficient tariffs that are cost reflective both in terms of energy and network components. Like this it's big question and very difficult. But again, the theory we developed can be used for the energy related components of the tariffs, particularly to incentivize the location and temporarily to do the right thing, but can also be extended to actually long-term reinforcement costs and savings. So if DR can actually contribute to savings in network reinforcement, or actually DR causes network reinforcements because of electric vehicles, how do we really assess that and we put it into tariff to be able to send the right temporal and spatial price signals? So this can be done in the context of the modeling, the DLMP modeling that we developed. And then operating envelopes can be sitting on top of that, both in terms of energy and capacity tariff changes. It just needs to be done in the right way. But the theory is such that the operating envelopes enacting reactive power can readily interact with the energy and network values of DR, again capturing the temporal and the locational aspects that we will need moving forward. And then fairness allocations can of course sit on top based on all the framework that we've developed in the project in any case. So if you look at kind of a bill like this, not the exact big breakdown as we have in Australia, things like coming from the US, can think of something like you have an energy component based somehow on DLMPs, and you can design operating envelopes to be consistent with the DLMP design. Then same is like the network component, potentially the capacity component also system level can be developed in a way is consistent with the design of the operating envelope, so that you change capacity allocation depending somehow on how much you want to save in terms of network capacity, or how much somehow you're contributing potentially to a network reinforcement. Therefore, you can modulate operating envelopes to limit that. And of course, fairness would be sitting on top of everyone else. Especially there is a component that's basically fixed per customer that seems to be like an important way forward, given the complexity that they were seeing from in different ways. So somehow fairness will now start to be considered both at the level of the operating envelopes, but also the way that fixed components are allocated to different customers. So this is already in the kind of agenda, of course, of the regulator, not only in Australia, but around the world. So huge complexity, because it's now no longer just a techno-economic environment with DR or CR, customer energy resources, somehow, or consumer energy resources. We really talk about social, techno-economic ecosystem that is like a new world. And to face the new world, we need to somehow new regulatory and commercial frameworks. Is it nested markets with the platform? So like distributed markets sitting together with large-scale markets, local exchange services around wholesale markets. Maybe we can do this by very intelligent tariffs. I don't know. Maybe there are different ways. We somehow we are developing different ways, different frameworks in the project edge, or in our research in general. I think there is like quite some solid foundation, and eventually we are kind of close to same level of I think fundamental change that we saw at the time of Edison, when he said more than a century ago, that only the rich eventually will burn candles, because electricity will be so cheap. So I don't know if electricity is really going to be ever so cheap as we wished, but somehow there are fundamental changes that we can certainly perform. And the context, all this work on operating envelopes somehow is supporting all these potential changes, and things can be done, of course, in an even better way. So there will be more research and more industry and regulatory work to be done in this context. But that's all very exciting. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pierluigi. We have a number of questions. I don't know where you can open the corresponding chat. There's a button there, chat, or I can tell you just the questions, and I don't know. I think it's faster that if
okay, very long questions.
Yeah, you need to pick some. We have
let me breathe.
Yeah, no worries.
Unflexible consumption. What happens? If consumption becomes flexible. Yes. So I guess so. Craig is asking slide 11-15. What happens if consumption becomes flexible? If consumption becomes flexible, it will somehow change. It will change those shapes. So instead of having an inelastic vertical demand, it will change the shape. So effectively, once we have active DR, we will change the shape of that. So instead of just shifting the curve, we have a change in the curve, but the effect will be the same, reducing the market prices eventually. Okay, long comment or question from team to traditional system. All matters at the supply side to really miss the opportunity and push shift load. Future forecast peaks can drive. I really, okay, team, I see what you wrote. I don't really see why there is a big bias toward traditional energy systems, despite I just don't see at all. It's what we have is fundamentals of physics and economics is really not just trying to say we have a system that exists, and do we want to discard it and do something completely different? Feel free to do it. It will never happen. We want to enable a transition. I think that what we're trying to do is very consistent to what things could be done. And again, it's not only us. I think the whole world is moving in the direction. Everything I presented goes exactly in the direction of enabling, empowering consumers to actually be able to participate in the right way to make the system efficient and somehow making money out of this potential. So there is absolutely nothing that is about traditional system. It's all about enabling a new system. Well, it can refer VPP as a virtual peaking plant, but a VPP will be very useful when actually you need to buy lots of electricity. Moving forward, when it's like lots of cheap electricity, you want to store that. So there's really not a virtual peaking plant in that case. Craig, slide 22, a geographical element of VPP. Yes, there is a geographical element of VPP potentially, depending on when you have local services. It's all about the local elements. That's when you need to have a proper framework that capture exactly temporally and locationally where the value is. But so are operating envelopes by definition. If we do not have kind of geographical aspects, we will not have that. So everything that we do technically or economically has got to have a temporal and a geographical aspect to really unlock value for the system. We study looked at future SKDR, this pretty close transmission, but it was encountered for the potential protection system safety concerns because of faults and so on. Yes, I mean, of course, no, there are technical issues that would be there anyway. Reverse power flows, operation of protections, and so on. So all those aspects about sit on top. And then every time that you try to develop a local services, of course, this will be done with, for example, the DSO. The DSO will know exactly what is happening, what can be done or not, and we pose constraints to that. So those nodal operating envelopes are introduced where you have like voltage and thermal limits. If there is something that cannot be done because of protection limits, then that can be introduced in the framework in a straightforward way. Now, the general principle is, do you have physical constraints or engineering constraints? What is the way that we capture it? That is the best possible way or the best possible. I mean, certainly one way of doing it, but it's not that we are forgetting about it. They can be there. They are very specific, and the moment that they are there, the DSO will be in the loop, and they will somehow help with that. Signals grid legacy transformers always getting tap alarms, which cause voltage issues. Okay. Yeah, I mean, that's, like transformer and voltage management is already quite a big problem. That's why we need to change things, and again, operating envelopes can help with that. Federal government is developing a national DR roadmap. Top recommendation incorporates research and operating envelopes and findings from Project Edge. So certainly try to think in an integrated way, between like the distributed resources and the whole system in operation and in planning. Peter, have you explored reactors could be combined with autonomous VOVA response? Yes, Peter, we've done that. Effectively, say VOVA control is very efficiently as a kind of distributed control, and then reactive power kind of may be more efficient from a market perspective. So there's a natural spectrum between control and market opportunities. And of course, the moment that you do VOVA control, you would reduce, for example, the opportunities for market contracts, but it may not necessarily be in the best possible way. So there is a little bit of interaction. We've done all the studies. There is lots of complexity in there. Very happy to discuss offline. It's in the reports that we wrote. Very, very good point there. What will be the future DOEs? Future research can integrate AI to determine DOE limits? Yeah, I think so. I mean, Nando has already done pretty much so much work on AI and DOEs. Are you presenting tomorrow, Nando? I think the AI part.
Yes.
Okay, so just stay tuned. Don't miss tomorrow with your AI and DOEs. So certainly there will be big research there. I think there will be more research to be done, interaction between economics and DOEs, network tariffs and DOEs and so on. We'll work on that. What is the epsilon axis comparing fairness slide? Okay, I need to look back for the question. Anyway, this will all be shared. So when you can look at details of my slides, you have some specific questions, please just send me an email and now I will address the question. Craig and the DOE should be running location with respect to transformers one becomes an input into system sizing. There may be. I think that's why we developed this the valuation framework. The moment that you understand clearly what is interaction between the economics and technical aspects in operation, then you can also look into plan. But so far we do not have clearly a framework that looked both an active and reactive power. If you don't do it properly, and again temporally and locationally, you can't plan properly either. So it's very possible that we would be looking to system sizing, interacting with operating envelopes moving forward. Question and answer will be saved in Canvas. I don't know, Nando, maybe?
Yeah, I was wondering what way we can do that. We can try. but I cannot promise.
How can we enable data to companies that want to help with the modeling of the
Low
network?
voltage network.
I think Nando.
Yeah,
will-
that's a great question,
will
Jamie. I
this.
mean, so there's a massive trend in Europe and some parts of America to have open source data, right? Now, of course, there's a component as well of privacy and merging both in a way that is effective, to do things is quite challenging. So the answer is yes, but there are many caveats. And releasing this data that is private is quite complex. And if you really want these LV network models to be validated, to be better, you need the smart meter data. And it's very unlikely that it's going to be shared just openly. So difficult. It's a difficult one, but yeah, it would be great, right? And with that, we finished today. Pierluigi, thank you very much for your marathon. You were teaching already in the morning, and then you came here to teach us as well. Arthur, thank you very much for the presentation as well in block 2. And this is where we will stop the recording in a few seconds. Join us tomorrow, and we will make the recordings available and the slides as well. Thank you very much, everyone. Cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you.